Welcome back. In this video, we'll discuss section 6.4, which is called Application, Consumer and Producer Surplus. The supply curve shows what quantity Q of the item the producers supply at different prices P. A typical supply curve is drawn here, and notice we've got Q, the quantity on the horizontal axis, and P, the price per unit on the vertical axis. The demand curve shows what quantity of goods are bought at various prices. So this kind of describes the consumer's behavior, and a typical demand curve is shown here. The market settles at the equilibrium price, P star, and equilibrium quantity, Q star, where the graphs cross. So notice in this picture the graphs cross here, so this value of Q right here would be the equilibrium quantity. I've labeled it Q star, and this price here would be the equilibrium price, which I've labeled P star. What we notice is at equilibrium, a number of consumers have bought the item at a lower price than they would have been willing to pay. In fact, some consumers would have been willing to pay whatever this price is all the way up here. Similarly, there are some suppliers who would have been willing to produce the item at a lower price. In fact, some of the suppliers would have produced the item for this price, whatever this is right here. If we consider the region trapped between the demand curve and this horizontal line at P star, we can think of this as measuring the consumer's gain from trade. So in other words, it's the total amount gained by consumers by buying the item at the current price rather than at the price they would have been willing to pay. And now if you look at the region kind of trapped between the supply curve and this horizontal line at P star, we can think of this as measuring the supplier's gain from trade. It's the total amount gained by producers by selling at the current price rather than at the price they would have been willing to accept. So we'll call the area of this region the consumer surplus, and the area of this region the producer surplus. Let's look at an example. For a particular product, the supply curve is given by Q equals 10p minus 30, and the demand curve is given by Q equals negative 2p plus 30. Now, typically we want these things in the form P equals, say, S of Q or D of Q. So we want P involving something just containing Q's. So we need to do a little bit of rearranging here. If you start with the supply curve, let's add 30 to both sides to get this equation. And then I'll divide through by 10 to get something of the form P equals just a bunch of things involving Q. And similarly for the demand curve, we'll start by subtracting 30 from both sides and then divide both sides by negative 2 to get this. P equals negative 1/2 Q plus 15. Let's start by finding the equilibrium price and quantity. The way we do this is we set the two equations or expressions for P equal to each other. So we'll set the 1/10 Q plus 3 equal to negative 1/2 Q plus 15. And that's what you see here. So then I'll do some algebra and try to get Q by itself. We end up with Q equals 20. This is the equilibrium quantity, so I'll label it Q star. Once we have Q star, we can go back to either one of the equations, the supply equation or the demand equation, and plug in that value, Q star equals 20. So I've gone back to this equation here, and I'm going to plug in Q equals 20. We end up with 1/10 times 20 plus 3. This is equal to 5. And that's our equilibrium price, which we'll label P star. What we need to do now is set up a definite integral to find the consumer and producer surplus. You see I've sketched the graphs of the supply and demand curves. They're both linear functions in this case. So let's start with the consumer surplus. We're wanting to find the area of the region trapped between the demand curve, this line here, and the horizontal line at the equilibrium price of 5. So the definite integral will have limits of integration from 0 to 20. We're going from q equals 0 to the equilibrium quantity of 20. And then we'll take the top curve, the demand curve, minus this equilibrium price of 5. So that's the setup for the definite integral, and now I'll just do a little simplifying of the integrand before I try to integrate. We have this. Here's an antiderivative which we need to evaluate from 0 to 20, and when you do that, you end up with $100 for the consumer surplus. For the producer surplus, we now want the area of the region trapped between the supply curve, this line here, and the horizontal line at our equilibrium price of 5. Again, the limits of integration will be 0 to 20. We take the top curve minus the bottom curve, simplify the integrand before you try to integrate, and on doing this we end up with $20 for the producer surplus. So that wraps up our discussion of consumer and producer surplus. See you next time.